Dear friends, welcome, and thank you so much for your presence. Thank you to Nozizwe for introducing me. In preparing my Richard Gush Lecture, I've been encouraged by advice number 27 from Quaker Faith and Practice in Southern Africa to reflect on and share my experiences. The Quaker voices in this book challenge me to give meaning to my life and live it with a sense of purpose. My topic is creating our world in love's image. I'm talking of our material world, planet Earth, of humanity's social and spiritual world, and our personal worlds. They're all interconnected. Our present and future lives and that of our fellow inhabitants depend on planet Earth, the speck in the Milky Way galaxy, one among an estimated 2 trillion galaxies or more, in an infinite, continually expanding and ever-evolving cosmos. We humans, too, are evolving, works in progress, in continual transformation. We're both creative and social beings, relational, interdependent, growing through and into love. Many African cultures have the idea that a person is a person through other people. Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. In Zulu and Xhosa, this is called Ubuntu. In Sotho, Boto. In Shona, Unhu. The psychologist Nhlanhla Mkhize says the ethic of Ubuntu is a call to action because an ethical being, a being with a moral sense, can't see the sufferings of another and not be affected. Who do we want to become? We make choices about that, in and through relationship with others who shape us as we also shape them. Through our choices, we, like the 1976 school children of Soweto, try to create the world we want. Our choices shape the world. I think this process continues after we die, through our relationships, work, and adventures. The times when we risked pushing beyond our comfort zones and challenging ourselves with the impossible. Love is the legacy we've received. Let that be the legacy we also leave for others. Where's God in all this? The conventional Christian stories I heard as a child were told as truth and never problematized. Now, absolutes don't fit for me. God is no longer the omnipotent and all-knowing supreme being who sacrificed his son Jesus to give me eternal life. Rather, I see God as a powerful idea created by people to explain our origins and the mysteries of life. Most cultures have a God idea. Its forms and names may change with time. The Zulu people's original name for the Supreme Being was Umvelingangi, the first to appear. Later, Christian missionaries and translators recast it to Unkulunkulu, the Great Great One. Wars have been waged and people subjugated in the names of the gods of Christianity and other religions. That's been possible because powerful ideas and stories become institutionalized and entrenched to powerful effect. The Christian God and Church, like many religions, are the products of patriarchal cultures. In our male-dominated world, they perpetuate hierarchy and control of men over women. This is not the world I want. Still, I understand people's desire for a God being they can relate to personally, our human need for faith and for examples to follow. The revolutionary life of Jesus, the carpenter's son, and his teachings about love inspire me. I now see God as the life forces of creative energy and love in people and other life forms, in everything that exists. This is a spiritual rather than a religious idea. The creative energy I'm talking about is in each of us. It's our hunger to do work, to make things, to fix what's wrong, to create beauty. It feeds our imagination. It makes me feel more alive, more passionate about living, more connected with everything and everyone. The capacity and hunger for love is in each of us. It hurts when we see others suffer. Love enables our empathy, makes us want to take away pain and its causes. It's our desire to be kind. Love feeds our struggle for a world of justice, fairness, truth, and human dignity. I want these two life forces to be expressed as fully as possible through me, you, and all people, for our greater well-being and to realize our true human potential. Did God create the universe? I don't know. To me, what I believe now matters less than how I live. Life has taught me to value open-mindedness above ideological conviction. It fits better with Ubuntu. Before sharing my personal story, let me offer for reflection advice number 28 from Living Adventurously. Advice 28 talks of moments of change in life. Now is such a time. We face 3 global pandemics: the coronavirus, human violence, and planetary warming. These crises threaten our lives. They also reveal just how deadly the inequalities and injustices of our human-created systems and structures are. At worst, they kill. At least, they sicken us physically, emotionally, spiritually. The poorest are worst affected. With excesses of breeding and consumption, we're heading faster towards the 6th mass extinction, which will likely include humans. Advice 28 offers a way to breathe spiritually and practically when deciding our direction at moments of change. It recommends we seek advice from trusted sources and our consciences, wait for the right time to undertake or relinquish responsibilities without fear, pride, or guilt, and embrace the task with loving enthusiasm. This is individual and also collective advice for friends. Now is a time to take greater personal and collective responsibility than ever to work for change. With loving enthusiasm and political will, we can remake our fundamental relationships with each other and the planet. That is our larger task, made up of many smaller tasks. Crises create opportunities and reveal human resourcefulness. C19 has produced tremendous creativity, global cooperation and collaboration, greater scientific capabilities. It's shown us the power of love through the dedication and sacrifice of healthcare workers. The changes it's imposed on human behavior are benefiting planetary health. These are examples of George Fox's vision of an infinite ocean of light and love flowing over the ocean of darkness. Our Quaker ancestors have lived out Fox's vision, often in very dark times. They've helped to abolish slavery, saved Jewish children from the Holocaust, and birthed gender equality. Margaret Hope Bacon's book, Mothers of Feminism, The Story of Quaker Women in America, starts with these words. On July 13th, 1848, 5 women sat around a mahogany tea table and planned a revolution. That revolution is spread widely, and the social change it started continues and deepens. Our binary idea of gender and sexual identity is becoming more fluid, moving towards understanding William Penn's insight that in souls there is no sex. Spiritually, there's no difference between people, regardless of gender and sexual preference. Quakers have started movements and organizations that outlast them and continue to change the world. The Alternatives to Violence Project, AVP, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, Oxfam, Friends Peace Teams, to name but some. Quakers are doing this today too. Recently, John and I attended a virtual memorial service for David Zaremka. African and some American friends will know that David, with his wife Gladys Kamunya, through Friends Peace Teams and in collaboration with Kenyan peacemakers, established the African Great Lakes Initiative, AGLI. David apparently never talked politics, but had the attitude, here's a problem, what can we do about it? So AGLI works across countries historically ruptured by colonialism, ethnic genocide, and deadly political conflict over mineral resources. Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, the DRC, to empower people to handle interpersonal conflict non-violently. It does this through AVP workshops and by other means. AGLI also focuses on trauma healing through a complementary program, Healing and Rebuilding Our Communities, HIROC. Before the FWCC World Gathering at Kabarak in 2012, John and I participated in a HIROC workshop in Sekendu, Western Kenya, which David and local peacemakers organized. Most participants were widows from Mount Elgon who'd lost their farms and livelihoods through violence in a land dispute going back to colonial times. They were IDPs, internally displaced persons, living in poverty amongst strangers. HIROC couldn't give them their land and livelihoods back, but sharing their stories helped the healing process they needed to rebuild their lives and recover a sense of community. David and Gladys died within days of each other from C-19 related complications. David's adult children and the peace facilitators of both continents who worked with him have practical plans to carry forward their legacy. Projects started by friends in various local meetings include River Rescue Utando Womlambo in Makanda, formerly Grahamstown, the Eastern Cape, and the Pilagade Care Home for people with disabilities in KwaZulu-Natal. So let's also plan and work for the revolution we desire locally and through SAQM's participatory research and action groups. Guidance, direction, and discernment may come to us from many sources: our consciences, the stillness and sharing of our meetings, teachers and mentors, Quaker writings and other literature, art and music, and sometimes through dreaming. Before I came to Quakers, when I was pregnant with my first child, a profound dream showed me my unborn infant. The sense of connection with him and within myself was so powerful that I woke in absolute clarity of spirit about my path. This brings me to the story of my personal journey. Some of it is difficult to tell and might be difficult to hear. I'll relate it and my topic to three factors that cause great suffering in Southern Africa and worldwide: structural racism, inequality, and poverty. Together with global capitalism, they form a violent social system characterized by injustice. Injustice is both a contributing factor and a consequence of the system. We are all implicated in its violence. Our witting or unwitting complicity ensures that the system perpetuates itself. But as it's made by people, people can disrupt and change it. We can interrupt the cycle of violence and build a non-violent, peaceable order. Margaret Mead assures us, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Mead, by the way, was educated from age 11 at Buckingham Friends School in Pennsylvania. With William Penn, I say, let us try what love will do. The visionary revolutionary poet William Blake reminds us that our time is short and that love is both light and heavy. And we are put on earth a little space that we may learn to bear the beams of love. So, to my story. The name I use, given me at birth, is Marie Frederica Odendaal. My father was Johann Friedrich Odendaal. My parents married soon after he returned from fighting in World War II. He'd been a prisoner of war in Italy. When he escaped, Italian families risked their lives to shelter him. He was Afrikaans. My mother, Dorothy Lorraine Cousins, was English. Both spoke the other's language. Our earliest home language was Afrikaans. In marrying, my parents were bridging a historical divide between the British and the Boere, Afrikaans farmers, which included, among other events, the Anglo-Boer Wars at the end of the 19th century. Many Afrikaners lost their land, homes, and livelihoods. Afrikaner women and children died in British concentration camps. More than 40 years later, there was still bitterness, hostility, and suspicion between Afrikaners and English. My father, a policeman, had to get permission from the police force to marry this English woman, seen as a potential security risk. We lived in a small country village called Richmond, in what was then Natal. The third of 4 children, I was born in 1951, 3 years after the Afrikaner Nationalist Party was elected by white South Africans to govern the country. There was no democracy, and black South Africans had no vote. Here are pictures of my siblings and me on a beach holiday. On the left is my brother Pete, then my sister Frances, myself, and my oldest brother Willem. I'm still uncovering and working against the ways apartheid, authoritarianism, and patriarchy shaped me as a person. Trying to transform myself is an ongoing process. In this talk, I'll use terms like black, white, African, Indian, etc., because apartheid used the social construct of race to classify, divide, and rule over people. Race is not real. It's an idea, a product of our minds. But the devastation caused by race thinking and racism, structural and personal, are very real. Let me share some concrete examples from my childhood. They'll be hurtful to hear, and I'm sorry. If you never lived under apartheid, they may help you to understand its realities and its damaging impacts on everyone. Its consequences still shape our society today, 27 years after democracy. As a child, I assumed that what I was experiencing was just the way things naturally were. At home, I only knew black people as servants, never as friends or social equals. It was a feudal servant system. My father had inherited a share of my grandfather's farm, and every year he instructed a different farm laborer to send one of his daughters to come and work in our home. She had to make our beds, clean the house, help prepare food, and do demeaning things like emptying the potties that each of us, including Ma and Pa, kept under our beds for peeing overnight. And yet the toilet was just down the passage from the bedrooms. The young women, as far as I remember, went home only once a year, though the farm was only 12 miles, 20 kilometers away. I never knew if any of them had children. The maid and the male gardener lived in one room in an outbuilding. There was a lumpy single bed on either side of the room, no dividing wall or curtain between, hardly any other furniture. They were strangers to each other, mind. Their shared ablutions were an open outside wash-up area with a tap, visible from the house, and a dank toilet round the back, a hole in the floor with a wall-mounted cistern above. My parents would have rejected outright such living arrangements for their own sons, and especially their daughters. I didn't like how my mother would get angry with the maid, but apart from that, I didn't really realize how wrong it all was. Now I feel ashamed that I was so unaware, and of my family's degrading treatment of other people. Only recently did it occur to me to wonder what, if anything, my mother provided for those young women when they had their monthly periods, and how many rapes may have taken place in that room. The term most whites commonly used for black people was the K word. Recently, I found a letter I'd written to my parents in Afrikaans when I was 13 or so. I was shocked and mortified to see that I'd used this word for the kitchen staff at the boarding establishment. Round about this time, Hendrik Verwoerd, regarded as the architect of apartheid, was assassinated. Politically naive, I mourned the death of our beloved Dr. Verwoerd in my English class journal. On weekends, we often went to the farm. We walked there a lot. It had a solid old stone farmhouse, wide open spaces, tree ferns, a sun-kissed stream that became a waterfall through rich indigenous bush. These experiences formed my love for and need to spend much time in nature. Below the cliffs were grasslands where the farm workers lived in huts and grazed the limited number of cattle they were permitted. The workers were paid in food rations and wages for hours worked. A headman, a nduna, supervised them. My father grew wattle trees. The men planted, felled, stripped the bark, chopped and loaded the wood onto lorries. They herded the cattle bellowing through the dipping tank as my father counted them and chose those to be auctioned off. My mother tasked the digging of the garden. She loved planting things, and the hammering of pegs across gullies to conserve soil and prevent further erosion. My father was a warm, loving father and a sociable person with friends and family, both Afrikaans and English. He drank, smoked, and gambled on the horses and the tattersalls with men of all races, regardless of the law. In other respects, he enforced the law and its punishments. My mother, a teacher, made me dresses and birthday cakes. She fostered my love for music through piano lessons. She taught herself to play later, and for reading. Every Saturday, she took my sister and me to the local library for books. There was a separate library for Indians, no library for Africans. My childhood view of God came first through my parents. Every evening we sat in their bedroom for family prayers, my father reading from the Bible, usually the Old Testament, and saying a long prayer in Afrikaans. Then we all recited the Onse Vader together. After going to bed, I'd hear them doing the same thing again, just the two of them. My father was an elder in the all-white Dutch Reformed Church. We children attended Sunday school for 7 years, confirmation classes 4 years, and church services. I don't remember the dominee ever smiling, nor the elders who taught Sunday school lessons. Everyone was a sinner, the Catholics the most sinful of all because they prayed to Mary. This was Christianity in the conservative, moralistic, patriarchal culture of Afrikaners, God's chosen people. The DRC propped up apartheid big time. So did the police, army, and courts, though I didn't comprehend any of that then. Friday afternoon Bible classes gave me a different feeling about God, Jesus, and myself. 2 German missionary sisters used cut-out figures on a felt board to tell us the same story. God loved us so much that he gave his only son, Jesus, to be crucified and die to save us from our sins. They and their God, who came to me through the medium of English stories, colourful pictures, and cookies and juice, seemed more loving than judgmental. He, yes, also he, resonated more with me, despite the stuff about sin. I remember kneeling down one night, asking Jesus to come into my heart, and feeling very happy when I got into bed. Maybe I was about 8 or 9 at the time. In high school, I conducted Bible studies for the younger children in the boarding establishment and sang in a small Christian choir. But I also began to think about things a bit more. When a scientist gave a talk one evening, I asked him why some scientists didn't believe in God. I forget his explanation, but he assured me that science and belief in God were not incompatible. A scientist whose cosmic spirituality later influenced me was the Jesuit mystic and paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin. He perceived all of creation as being imbued with spiritual power. From the moment that the now billions-year-old cosmos flared into existence, God was a creative God coming into being, a continual process of becoming. Teilhard's study of ancient fossils in China, including his part in discovering Peking man, our ancestor who learned to control fire, led him to write in his book, Toward the Future, "Someday, after we've mastered the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. then for the second time in the history of the world, we will have discovered fire. He also said, the most telling and profound way of describing the evolution of the universe would undoubtedly be to trace the evolution of love. What extraordinary, revolutionary ideas. When June Houston, a co-founder of the Human Potential Movement, was a young girl, she met and then regularly walked with Mr. Taylor in Central Park. He'd marvel at and fall in love with everything, like falling on his knees to examine and exclaim at the beauty of a caterpillar with its little furry body, little green feet on the road to metamorphosis. He suggested she think of her own metamorphosis. What will you be when you become a butterfly? What is the butterfly of Jean? And, Jean, look at the clouds, God's calligraphy in the sky, all that transforming, moving, changing, dissolving, becoming Jean. Jean, become a cloud and become all the forms that ever were. Teilhard's ideas were controversial among scientists and the Catholic Church, which banned him from writing, teaching, and even speaking about them. And yet, Jean said, he had what few church officials had, the power and grace of the love that passes all understanding. He saw love as the evolutionary force, the omega point, that lures the world and ourselves into becoming. Spoke about the desire atoms have for each other, all of creation longing for that radiant bonding, for becoming more by virtue of yearning for and finding the other. Another controversial contemporary physicist, Nassim Haramein, says, imagine how the world will change when humanity realizes its interconnectedness with all life and works together to restore the health and well-being of the whole. Scientists now recognize that we are all made of stardust and that our own atoms of dust will continually be remade into many different forms. The more science reveals of the mystery of life, the more there will be to discover, to wonder at, to love. To return to my own story. At my liberal all-white English university, some people and experiences encouraged critical thinking. A course of theology exposed me to fundamental philosophical issues. It included a section on Marxism. Marx's ideas made sense to me. Questioning traditional Christian beliefs, I stood somewhere in between the politically conservative, happy-clappy evangelical SCA types and the left-wing anti-apartheid student Christian movement, and moved away from institutionalized religion altogether. Influenced by a fellow student, a film on factory farming, and William Blake's words, "Everything that lives is holy," I also became vegetarian. Before this, in my first year of university, I went on a year-long American Field Service scholarship, living with a family in Delaware and attending Christiana High School. This offered me many transformative experiences. AFS was the first time I met people of different races from different countries, including fellow Africans, though no black South Africans, on an equal footing. A seminar class introduced me to the US Constitution and Bill of Rights. The Vietnam War was on, and students were divided over it. Some whose family members had been killed in action were most fervent in their support of it. I watched the first ever moon landing on television. TV was also a first-time experience. And for the first time, I was kissed by a young black lad who was a complete stranger. It happened this way. My American family paid for me to have piano lessons in Wilmington. One day, while waiting for my lesson, this lad made eye contact and, finger on lips, beckoned me to follow him outside. When we were safely round the corner, he said, "Close your eyes." Wondering, I did so. Then, to my astonishment, I felt his warm, moist lips on mine. My eyes flew open, and I said the first thing I could think of, "Thank you." We went back inside. I reflect now on his courage in taking that risk in that racially polarized society. That kiss was a precursor to later events in my life. Fast forward through my university years as an arts student majoring in English and drama. These included being on the SRC, Students' Representative Council, where I tried to foster interracial contact through a cultural festival and advocated for bridging the divide between English and Afrikaans. The Conservative student body voted to dissolve our SRC. The anti-apartheid activities of the minority student activists from NUSAS raised my political awareness. I participated in the End Petty Apartheid sticker campaign and some protest actions which the police broke up with their dogs, arresting some of us. Mainly, though, I tried to do what I thought was constructive. Help build a clinic for pregnant African women in the rural area of Msinga, tutor elderly African people trying to obtain their matriculation at a night school in the Odendaal township. Fast forward also through my 4.5 years of teaching in white government schools. When the government in 1976 passed an act compelling teachers to register on the South African Teachers' Council for Whites, entrenching separate education even further, I decided to leave and travel outside South Africa. Another rapid fast forward through 4.5 years of travel and work on an Israeli kibbutz, in a community theatre and restaurants in the USA, a solo cycle trip through England, Ireland, and Wales, and 2 love relationships. I felt like a citizen of the world. But a documentary film confronted me with the horror of what had happened in my own country on 16 June 1976. It included direct footage and interviews with survivors, like a young woman paralyzed for life, speaking from her wheelchair. The Soweto uprising had coincided with the arrival of television in South Africa, but television coverage of the events had abruptly been cut. Soul searching and the pull of South Africa brought me home in 1983. This was the start of a new phase in my life. I was cast as Juliet in a production of the tragedy Romeo and Juliet, intended for audiences of black school students. The play was a set work for their matric exams. To enable them to relate to Shakespeare's story, the director transposed the characters and events to South Africa. We workshopped the scenes and put the dialogue into everyday English. The deadly conflict between the families of Juliet Capulet and Romeo Montague, Juliet's lover, was the racial divide between white and black in South Africa. I used my own name, Mari, and my lover Romeo used his own name, Pagade. We performed in school halls in the townships. Each time the moment arrived when Mari and Pagade kissed, there would be a great stir in our audience. Sometimes laughter, perhaps of disbelief. Love between people of different races was illegal. Interracial couples risked prison. Those were the opening bars of my relationship with the man who, in 1985, became the father of our first child, Maibuya, and later my husband and father of our second child in Sikelelo. His firstborn son, Delani, also joined our family. Pagade means forever. I called him Pax for short, and loved that that word means peace. Pax and his family, the Magwazas, opened a space for me amongst South Africa's people from whom apartheid had always tried to separate me. Their love transformed my life. At the start of our relationship, I knew little about the political events in Pax's home township, Lemontville, which spurred his actions and altered the course of everything for both of us. I can only summarize our story here. Our play ended abruptly when Pax was arrested during a performance of his protest play, Asinamali. Asinamali means we have no money. It was a slogan of a campaign against rent and bus fare increases. Pax was charged, when arrested, as an associate in the murder of a man seen to be the leader of a criminal gang used by the government to assassinate members of ANC-affiliated organizations in Lemontville. He came out on bail and was later tried and sentenced to 8 years imprisonment. It was 1985, and I was 3 months pregnant with Maibuya. Pax was twice granted bail, pending appeals. After we'd married, he lost his second appeal and went into exile in the then so-called independent Transkei. Our second child, Nsikelelo, was 3 months old. In the interim, we'd moved from Durban to Pietermaritzburg, where I started working at the university. Pax returned from exile a year later after negotiations between his ANC lawyer and the state to serve another month's imprisonment before he was released and his record expunged. Some years later, he appeared before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and was granted amnesty. His testimony is online in the TRC records. My political views had long since diverged from my family's, and at first I didn't tell them about my relationship with Pax. When I discovered I was pregnant, I told my sister that I was expecting his child, but said nothing about his situation. She told my brothers they all decided to keep my pregnancy secret from my parents. They tried to persuade me to take various courses of action to this end. I refused. After my boy was born, I wrote to my mother and sent her a picture. At first, she kept the news secret from my father, fearing he'd have a heart attack. Once he knew, I took my baby to meet my parents, his grandparents. Our visit wasn't a happy one. My parents soon moved to the farm, which they'd long talked about doing. They were ashamed and wanted to avoid gossip and stigma in the village. Although my sister maintained some contact with me, I was estranged from the rest of my family. My brother Pete and I only reconciled years later. In September 1989, my oldest brother Willem was murdered on a farm in the Ekropo district. He apparently confronted 2 men for being where he thought they had no right to be, on another farmer's farm. They attacked him with an axe. In court, they claimed self-defense, saying he'd threatened them with the gun he was carrying. It was devastating for his wife, his 2 young daughters, and my parents and siblings. I went alone to Willem's funeral. Pax and I feared how people would react if they saw him there. Early in 1990, I visited my parents on the farm, together with my boy and his playmate Ntombi. My parents were kind to the children and me. There was a softening on their side. But the news that Pax and I had decided to marry and have a second child didn't go down well, despite them never having met Pax, nor knowing his story. Our decisions to marry and have another child had been precipitated by my brother's death, the recognition that life is short, and that to wait for the outcome of Pax's second appeal, he'd lost the first one and had had to return to prison, was to allow the state to control our lives. When Pax and I married in Lamontville in March 1990, that momentous year when Nelson Mandela was released, I sent my family invitations, but didn't personally invite them to attend, and none of them did. In Zulu culture, when 2 people marry, their families are being united. My family didn't want that. I imagine they also feared going into the township. My parents were not safe on the farm, though. A few months later, they were murdered. We had never fully reconciled, and they had never met Pax, never wanted to meet him. I was with his family in Lamontville when I got the news. Pax's mum grabbed me and held me. "Don't cry, don't cry." Nsikelelo was born the next day, 8th of July, 1990. Pax could not accompany me to my parents' funeral. Pax and I were married for nearly 10 years before we divorced. We had happy times, but little stability. I won't recount the challenges, turbulences, and joys of our lives together, our weaknesses and strengths, the efforts we made, and the love and support we gave and received from each other and from many other people. It was not enough to carry us through. The breaking up of our family life was deeply painful. Inevitably, the inequality of our circumstances is shaped by apartheid. My life of educated white privilege and economic security, as against his of systematic disadvantage and oppression as a black person, put me in a stronger position to cope after the divorce. Insofar as I could, I tried to support him and encourage contact between him and our children, whom he loved a lot. His family continued to accept me with love. His parents, both of whom have now died, were mum and dad to me. Pax, having suffered ill health and high blood pressure, died suddenly in October 2007 at the age of 45, apparently from a stroke. We buried him in Le Montfort. I can't pay adequate tribute to Pax as a person in the space of this lecture. He was an ANC political activist and fighter for freedom, an actor and playwright, social documentary photographer, mentor to young artists, and later an HIV educator to farm labourers. The best I can do is show you some of his photographs. They reflect the times we lived in and his concerns. He documented the lives of ordinary people, and especially women, the hardships of the poor, of hostel dwellers, and people whose homes were demolished under the Group Areas Act, like 95-year-old Mrs. Gladness Klongwane. He documented the grievous losses and trauma people suffered at the hands of the state, and people's protests, commemorations and celebrations, joys and desire for peace. Above all, Pax was a vital, warm, creative person who should have been able to have a different life in a different society. Quakers come into the story around the time Maibuya was born, when Pax was in prison and I was working for a non-profit in Durban. When Maibuya was 3 months old, we needed a home. Richard Steele and Anita Kromberg, former SAQM clerks, invited me to share theirs, and I learned of Quakers from them. Richard had been imprisoned as a conscientious objector and endured a hunger strike. He and Anita were often on the run from the security branch and military police for their work in the End Conscription campaign and the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. Our home was raided twice during their absence. The second time, Pax had just come out on bail. I was carted off for a 10-day spell of imprisonment under the State of Emergency Act, in the same prison where my friends Nozizwe Maglala and Jeremy Routledge were detained. Richard and Anita's generosity and support in sharing their home with us helped us survive that difficult time. In Pietermaritzburg, I attended Quaker meetings in Mark and Julie Purville's home. I didn't really know what to do with myself during the meetings, but in contrast with my estrangement from my family and sense of alienation from whites generally, I felt accepted by this friendly little group, not judged or viewed with hostility. The first yearly meeting I attended with Pax and the children was at Roma in Lesotho around the early or mid-90s. At a yearly meeting in the late 90s, I experienced a Taster Alternatives to Violence Project, AVP, workshop. After organizing and attending a full basic workshop, I incorporated AVP into a leadership course for university students. Their enthusiasm for it exceeded my expectations. Papama initiatives helped provide all 3 levels of training and developed our capacity to offer the workshops ourselves. Sadly, though, white students didn't participate, nor did political student leaders in the SRC. Students from other African countries were more eager to benefit from leadership training than local students. In 1996, together with Nsiki Sibeko, also a Quaker, I had served as an ecumenical peacemaker monitoring political events in the run-up to the first local government elections. Later, I collaborated with a colleague in adult education, Vaughan John, to run a peace education course with people from warring political parties. Vaughan introduced AVP into his courses, and together with students, we formed a local AVP facilitator network, AVP KZN. Jeff Harris introduced AVP into his postgraduate peace studies and conflict resolution, from where it has traveled to other African countries. AVP is the best experiential training process for eliciting and channeling the power of love, Ubuntu, to change lives and relationships that I've ever come across. AVP builds self-esteem, offers a practical response to conflict that helps us prevent it from escalating into violence, and enables us to build relationships of respect and trust. I could wish I'd encountered it sooner. AVP can be of value to all of us. AVP needs support and funding, locally and internationally. It took me 20-odd years of regularly attending our local Quaker meeting and many yearly meetings before I formalized my membership as a Quaker. John Ingalls, my partner since 2002, and I now host Quaker meetings in our home. Here is a picture of my family today. Behind me in this picture is Nsiki, and next to me, Nsiki's wife, Kylie. Behind John is Maibuya. Next to John is Nombulelo, partner to Delani. And in this picture, you can see Delani giving a haircut to the first Magwaza grandchild in my family, Samkelo Solwazi. Also living with us are Pax's niece, Samgelisiwe, and her 6-year-old son, Ayabonga. John's love for me and mine, and our family's love for one another, have looked on the tempests of life and not been shaken. And with the psalmist, I can say, the lines have fallen unto me in lovely places. Yea, I have a goodly heritage. Having shared my story, I want to reflect on my themes of racism, poverty, and inequality through a focus on land. I haven't researched the history of the farm. It took me years to question whether it was previously stolen from people who were living there. Whether so or not, the long history of land dispossession from 1652 onwards, including by British settlers such as Richard Gush and the Voortrekkers, my father's forebears, all profoundly disrupted the way of life and social fabric of families and communities, of peoples whose culture and spirituality were deeply rooted in the land. Today, June 16, marks 108 years since the Natives Land Act of 1913. 7% of the land went to 5 million black people, and 87% to fewer than 350,000 colonial settlers. This disempowered black people economically, and they became homeless, locked in servitude, a migratory labor force. The 1950 Group Areas Act and the forced removals of 3.5 million black people between 1960 and 1983 continued this and further entrenched racial segregation. This historical violence laid the foundations for continuing attacks and murders of people living on farms, farmers and laborers. Dispossession served both the agricultural and industrial interests of a white-controlled economy. This 1947 painting by Gerard Sikoto reflects the labor structure and extractive power relations of urban industrial mining. The 2012 massacre of Marikana miners was one of the worst atrocities of post-apartheid South Africa. Dispossession of land, social destruction, and land hunger characterize all colonized countries in Africa and elsewhere. Corruption and failures of governance are also common. The ongoing effects are obvious in both rural and urban areas. The squalor of crammed informal settlements around cities gives rise to violent service delivery protests like those in Gatvol, which stinks of raw sewage. Land invasions, followed by forceful removals, are frequent. Land restitution alone won't solve the numerous and complex problems and ongoing conflicts caused by historical injustices, nor enable rural or urban people to have sustainable livelihoods or free them from poverty. Simon Gush, an artist, filmmaker, and descendant of Richard Gush, highlights some of these issues in 3 films on land dispossession and restitution, as seen through the eyes of land claimants in Salem, where Richard Gush took land. Simon has kindly agreed that I can play an extract from one in this talk. It comes from the last of the 3 films, Working the Land.
So if people could be given the means of production, For the land they got, that's fine. But I say it is pointless to give someone the land when he's not going to do anything about it.
If the farms failed to generate profits in these difficult conditions, the community would be forced back into the labor market, and the land might ultimately have to be put up for sale. This would not only undermine the process of restitution, it would repeat the cycle of dispossession once more.
Ngabuza iCommission ba sifuna imali nakho sifuna umhlaba. Sathi la sifuna umhlaba azifuni imali. Hayi. Funa umhlaba. Imali asifuni. Umhlaba upheli. Basilapha ngoku ngenxa yomhlaba. Babe nthatha imali ngoku, imali ngesiphelile. Lapha ngoku ngenxa yomhlaba. Into endiqosayo le kuba ke ndibuyele kumhlaba wobawo omkhulu. Ndizohlala apha efama. Kanti oba mna ndinezigqibo mna. Andube ndimke apha efama. Andifuni ubheka edolophini, ndifuna ulala apha ekhaya. Ndifuna uhlala apha. Le ndawo uba omkhulu lifa andikwa ngootata.
Restitution can never return all that has been taken. It cannot account for hundreds of years of colonialism and dispossession. It cannot undo the violence and oppression. But if we are to take seriously the process of return, the question of what has been taken and what is being returned needs to be asked. Our current idea of restitution is too timid, too small. A much bigger and more expansive form will be required, if it is to have a chance of working.
I think one day I will be successful. I will be one of the farmers. Because I don't want to be the small farmer, only the small farmer. My goal is to be like to grow up, to grow, to be a emerging farmer.
Mungezi Madinda, the old man whose longings you've just heard in that extract, has since died. As this lecture is given in Richard Gush's name, I strongly encourage friends to watch Simon's 3 films, Land is in the Air, A Button Without a Hole, and Working the Land, as you reflect on our Quaker legacy, past, present and future. They are available on his website, simongush.net. So what can we do to create our societies in the image of love? To build what Martin Luther King called the beloved community, a world based on justice, equity and love, which embraces everyone. I've already mentioned some of the things SAQM friends are doing. We can do more and be more intentional, all of us. I'll just mention 2 key points for reflection. How can we explode the myths of race, transform racist attitudes and behavior, our own and others, and challenge systemic racism? How can we contribute to restitution and redress for past injustices and work for reconciliation? I have some ideas as to the what and how, but rather than presenting them now, I suggest that friends engage in discussion in your own meetings. I've sent my ideas to our SAQM co-clerks if you'd like to receive them. At this point then, I want to thank the co-clerks Justin Ellis and Sipho Nsimbi, and the nominations committee who risked offering me the privilege and opportunity of this lecture. Thank you to our technical team, Nancy Fee and George and Chindia, and to the videographer, Johan Pretorius and his assistant Spare. I appreciate the inspiration I gained from reading various Richard Gush, James Backhouse and Swarthmore lectures, and many other Quaker writings. And I'm most grateful for the sharing of ideas and constant support and help of various people, including Bridget Crone for editorial help and John Ingalls, who has given me editorial help, encouragement, and moral support on this journey. I'd like to end this talk with these words of the late President Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Firstly, it always seems impossible until it's done. And then, no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin or their background or their religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Thank you all for listening. May our journeys and our world be blessed with love.